I love that in a life that I got to live, before I knew them, my priorities were different. Everyone was taken aback. The Hollywood darling who was famous for her strength cried out and then did the unimaginable. Everyone wasn't expecting this. After enduring childhood fame, substance abuse, and public uproar, what was the last straw that caused Drew to abruptly withdraw? The world was merely surprised by the reality, which is deeper than it appears. A childhood-deprived girl, Drew Barrymore was hand-escorted around Hollywood gatherings as a gawky kid long before she became the teary presenter who made headlines for fleeing the set. The spotlight was thrust onto her rather than gently guiding her into it. Drew didn't only inherit a heritage, she inherited a hardship. When she was born into an acting dynasty, John Drew Barrymore, her father, was a tragic figure who disappeared due to his addiction. Drew was her mother Jade's passport to stardom, which she aspired to achieve herself. Regular bedtime and a playground did not exist. Prior to her ability to spell her own name, she was already surrounded by studio lights, cameras, and casting calls. At 5 years old, Drew was already winning over fans in E.T., but no one saw that she was actually just a small girl whose real life was in utter disarray. Studio 54 was her frequent hangout before she even started middle school. This is not only a metaphor, it is an undeniable truth. Drew was learning to navigate adult environments, complete with pressure, drugs, and predators, at a time when most kids are still learning to ride a bike. She was led into the lion's den by her mother, who did little to shield her from the perils of Hollywood. Spokes started to appear quickly. Drew began to imbibe about 9 o'clock, she was puffing on her joint around 10 o'clock, she progressed to cocaine by 12. What we saw here were not untamed adolescent experimentation, but rather frantic efforts to flee. Photos of her at nightclubs were circulated by paparazzi, and the newspapers were preoccupied with gossip rather than covering her live plea for assistance. A child's collapse beneath the weight of adult anguish was behind the headlines. At some point, the system attempted to step in. A mental hospital stay followed, rehabilitation. Drew was saved by her own determination, not by any institutions. She formally separated from her parents when she was 14 years old. In the absence of a safety net, only one option remained. There she was, a mere girl in an apartment attempting to make her way through life as all eyes were on her. She didn't finally gain control of her life at that time, rather, it marked the beginning of her struggle to do so. Not even freedom could get rid of the past, those wounds followed Drew into adulthood, shaping her empathy, comedy, and vulnerability on film. During an interview, she remarked, "I had to be an adult when I was a youngster because now that I'm an adult, I want to remember what it's like to be a kid again." Her artistic pursuits were not free from the shadow of her past, a life in which she had never had the luxury of innocence. It's understandable that her latter talk show character struck such a chord with her viewers. Not only was she vivacious and positive, but she was also forthright. She carried her history like a denim jacket, tattered yet fashionable, brimming with tales and hard to ignore. Drew was well respected and trusted by everybody. Knowing she had gone through the worst and still managed to laugh it off is what gave her the trust of others. What happens though when an individual of such strength ultimately gives in? Recent occurrences proved that Drew still hadn't escaped all of her demons. Some remained silently in the wings or backstage until the lights became too bright once more. She had more baggage from her history. The subsequent emotional collapse that unfolded live on television was much more than simply a writer's strike or reaction. It went deeper than that. It was the end of a woman's childhood, the beginning of her rebuilding, and the moment that would reveal the hidden pressure she had been carrying. Living on the precipice of a demise, the line between acting and agony was always razor-thin for Drew Barrymore. Attempting to maintain composure in front of the cameras had been her life's work. There was always a lady clinging to life beneath the beautiful magazine covers and attractive on-screen grins. The emotional weight of decades finally burst out in real time when Drew sobbed on national television. The incident occurred during a humorous part on her show after her companion casually brought up the topic of remorse. Drew's countenance abruptly transformed, her voice quivered, and tears filled her eyes. As is her typical defense technique, she attempted to laugh it off, but tears eventually flowed nonetheless. Following this, There was no predetermined plan, no one was whispering in her ear from backstage. Nothing but raw emotion, a host who had exhausted all pretense and complete quiet. "I apologize," she murmured as she rose to her feet. With those words, she stepped down off the stage. Their jaws dropped, they were all taken aback by her. Moments later, altered and analyzed video of the incident was making the rounds on the internet. How was she doing? Had it been staged? Could this be the start of a more serious problem? While we didn't get the answers right away, it was evident that Drew Barrymore had a revelation that day. Although it wasn't the initial instance, it could have been the most well-publicized. Not only was the talk show presenter losing her cool, but the woman was also falling apart in the field that had almost ruined her before. Later, sources close to the situation verified the supporters' worst fears. Drew had been under tremendous strain for months. She had unanticipatedly suffered additional damage to her reputation as a result of the consequences of continuing her program during the Hollywood strike. She had made an effort to please everyone, her employees as a boss, her fans as a public figure, and her polarized audience as a friend. However, she became disoriented while performing that juggling performance. A member of the team broke the news that the actress felt responsible for disappointing everyone. It was all too much for her. It was more than simply a poor choice. It crushed her will to live, not to mention how much more difficult Drew's life off camera has gotten. She had been quietly fighting off yet another relapse. Her loved one saw the warning signs, she skipped meetings, acted strangely, and smiled when she didn't feel like it. She had been very forthright in the past about her struggles with addiction, but her fight had never truly ended. Maintaining sobriety was an ongoing struggle, not an end point. In the midst of all the mayhem in 2023 and early 2024, she was once again on the losing end. After Drew admitted to drinking again during a particularly bad week, a longtime therapist moved away, claiming professional limits. She kept showing up in public until she couldn't anymore. There were more instances than that collapse. Too much time spent striving to fulfill unrealistic expectations led to this. Drew has become a symbol of weakness, but there are limitations to even weakness. Everyone heard the collapse. Online comments surged in the hours after Drew Barrymore's emotional exit from her own program. Within minutes, clips of her sobbing had gone viral, reaching millions of viewers by the end of the day. To what extent is she unharmed became the question doing the rounds. It was the authenticity of her feelings, not their rawness, that stunned onlookers. Given the prevalence of filters and insincere apologies in today's society, Drew's breakdown stood out for its genuineness. Many news organizations tried to cover the incident, but they failed miserably in finding the correct tone. While some headlines skewed toward worry, others toward conjecture. However, the personal experiences that were shared on social media stood out among all the commotion. Many viewers from different parts of the globe expressed how witnessing Drew's comedic and tragic moments on film allowed them to be more authentic and relatable throughout their own struggles. "If Drew can still show up after breaking down, maybe I can too," a fan tweeted, her sentiments resonating with tens of thousands of replies. There was a state of crisis among the producers behind the scenes. The fate of Drew's return the next day, if at all, remained a mystery. Many of her co-workers had been with her since the show's 2020 debut, and their loss was devastating. According to an unidentified crew member who spoke to Variety, "We've seen her fatigued, agitated, even depressed unlike any before." Nobody was acting there. Drew was very embarrassed by that. The show's future was supposedly discussed in emergency meetings by executives. There were those who wanted a vacation and those who thought the rumors would only become worse if the absence was extended. Little did anyone know that shortly after leaving the scene, Drew had discreetly checked herself into a wellness resort in Northern California, renowned for its discreetness and holistic approach. Not a rehab clinic, not a luxury spa, but a secret, clandestine mental health center. She required a place to detach, contemplate, and above all, breathe. The choice wasn't about hiding, according to her close friends. She was aware, according to one acquaintance, that she had reached a wall. The repercussions weren't something she was attempting to avoid. All she needed was some room to absorb the enormity of the situation. Leaving the limelight seemed like a loss and a need for someone whose entire life had been consumed by the camera. Drew started to write amid that stillness, journals documenting the journey from anguish and shame to remembrance, and ultimately, acceptance. No scripts or public relations pronouncements. She went on to call those weeks some of the loneliest, most healing days of my life. It had been years since she hadn't felt the need to be someone else, a brand, a mother, a presenter, or a Hollywood charm. At her core, she was just Drew, vulnerable, scared, and at last, true to herself. Not even a standing ovation or hoopla welcomed her back to her program a few weeks later. On the contrary, she said, "I wasn't around." Instead of applauding, the audience sobbed alongside her, an unforgettable choice that shifted everything. In the closing moments of a live taping, Drew Barrymore made an astonishing announcement, one that left the crowd in utter quiet just a few times after her comeback. "This show saved me once," she remarked, her voice quivering with emotion. The sentence was more than a beautiful expression, it was a genuine, unrehearsed, and heartbreaking admission of defeat. It was announced that Drew Barrymore will be leaving her own program indefinitely. The audience was at a loss for words. Was it a short hiatus? A rebranding initiative? Or something more long-term perhaps? Uncertain about cutting to commercial, the camera lingered on Drew's face for a few more seconds. However, she remained unmoved. With her eyes closed, she paused to take a deep breath and savored the moment. No one cheered. The stage was silent, and clapping was non-existent as Drew stepped gingerly away from the platform, abandoning the set in a phase of her life she had outgrown. Online, word spread like wildfire. Reporters rushed to corroborate what they had seen. Truly, it was within the hour a brief and tragic statement was issued by Drew's representatives. Drew Barrymore has chosen to resign as host of her show to concentrate on her mental health and her family. Following profound contemplation and in view of current events, this isn't the end of the road, for the time being, it is farewell. The message's simplicity accentuated its impact. No other remarks will be made. It was shocking for Hollywood. It seemed like Drew had finally figured out the daytime TV landscape, crafting an environment that seemed like a cross between a soul session, a variety show, and therapy. The void that her silence created in that room was palpable. Co-workers showed their support. "Your greatest gift is your heart," Jennifer Garner tweeted. "Give yourself as much time as you need." "What you did today takes courage," remarked Ellen DeGeneres, a former talk show presenter. According to CBS insiders, Drew's decision was not made out of the blue. "I hope you discover solace in the solitude." Her ability to continue revealing so much of herself on stage had been a topic of lengthy discussions behind the scenes, with producers, friends, and therapists. The emotional toll was growing. Despite the show's devoted fans, there were days when she would sob right before we started, one unnamed crew member said. You could see the strain behind her smile. But for the audience, she would pull it together. She had gotten overwhelmed by the crowd, even though they were the ones she had previously said gave her courage. While on break, Drew told a friend that she felt trapped in transparency. People expected more and more of her the more she gave. What was once her strength, her vulnerability, was now her weakness. "I was expected to shed tears. They want a brief respite. I am not a moment though, I am a person," she remarked. Drew was emotionally dry, physically drained, and living on borrowed happiness. That was the basic truth. Outside the door to the changing room following that evening, Drew took her time getting home. Rather than that, she headed for the beach, her former sanctuary. Seated on the bonnet of her vehicle, she bundled herself in a sweatshirt and reminisced as she gazed at the dark waves crashing against the shore. She started to write. In the midst of the stillness and the sound of the waves, a simple journal entry, not a script or section, "I no longer wish to be everyone's everything. Not only from my show," she wrote. "I can be exhausted if I want to. I am free to take a break." She continued to decline interviews with news outlets in the days that ensued. She chose to instead send a handwritten message to each member of her show's staff. "You gave me light when I had none," was the message on one card. "I pray I returned part of it to you. After living her entire life in the spotlight, the time had come for her to fade into oblivion and gather the fragments that success had dispersed. She jotted down "I'm just healing" at the bottom of one note, before continuing, "I'm not done." Well, she did get well, just not in any of those fancy spas or posh getaways. Drew suddenly started helping out at a Brooklyn women's shelter. At first, nobody noticed her. Using the same techniques that had helped her succeed in rehabilitation, she now leads workshops where survivors may learn to journal. "We're not broken," she assured them. Her rebuilding became her salvation, her therapy, and her revolution all rolled into one. During those weeks of solitude, she was supposedly more authentic than ever, according to those closest to her. There is no lamp. Studio not available. Not much more than a lady rediscovering life on her own terms after coming to grips with being misunderstood, disappointing others, and prioritizing her sanity above her public persona. The unexpected farewell. Drew Barrymore unintentionally resigned from her on-air role. Network officials didn't even approve of it, let alone script it or rehearse it. Something changed when she took the stage for what was meant to be an ordinary performance. The lights in the studio were suddenly too intense, and her voice quivered. The crowd applauded without realizing they were seeing a heartfelt farewell. A single tear dripped down her cheek as she stood center stage, microphone in hand, and vented years of strain, anguish, and quiet fights. Her voice quivered as she replied, "I've given everything I have. Now I need to give something to myself." The audience, realizing the seriousness of the situation, hushed in reverence. She was taking back control of her life, not giving up television. She stepped off stage not for dramatic effect, but because she was sick of acting, saying, "This isn't the end of a show, it's the beginning of something I haven't felt in years." Freedom. The cameras were still rolling as she said this. No climactic door smash or standing ovation, just Drew, embracing the unknown with the same vulnerability that captivated the world in her 90s glory. Drew Barrymore's departure was more than a fleeting incident, it served as a reflection. We saw what happens when a survivor lady screams enough. It served as a reminder that even our heroes have their moments of weakness. By breaking down, Drew continued her tradition of making us feel less isolated.